The Russian forces have managed to gain full control over Siversk, including all of the residential buildings in the outskirts of the city, as well as a push to the southwest direction of the southern fortifications, where the Russians are working on outflanking the fortifications of the Ukrainians north of the towns alongside the defensive line here near Sviatopokrovsk and Reznikivka. At the same time, fighting continues over fortifications, where the Russians are now storming them both from the eastern direction directly head-on and from the western flank, where they're looking to outflank the fortifications and attack them from their weak points. In addition to this, there were numerous advances by the Russians across the front line, where the Russians have managed to advance southwest of Minat, within Hulyaipole, now having control over 30% of the city. To the north along the second line of defense, in the eastern section of the front line and the eastern flank of the River line near Kopansk, and along the border between the Belgorod and the Kharkiv region, as well as to the southwest of Vovchansk, gaining full control over the town of Liman in that direction. There is reports by Deep State Map that the Ukrainians have managed to encircle the Russian forces within the city. However, I'm waiting for further confirmation from additional sources due to the general inaccuracies of the Ukrainian Deep State map in that area. I do believe it has happened, but the details, I need to clarify those details before I can report on it to keep the map as accurate as possible. Besides, it's an update that is breaking news, unlike the remaining updates through this update, where all of the remaining updates have happened over the past 24 hours. Starting out in the Siversk direction, the Russians managed to gain full control over Siversk itself. With this geolocated footage, we see the full capture of the city itself, and the second geolocated image shows the additional push to the southwest along the forest lines, where the Russians are here working alongside the fortifications that are all situated to the southwest of Siversk, where the Ukrainian fortifications here are facing the southern direction for the defense of these settlements and to prevent the Russian capture of the highway leading up to the rear of Siversk for the defense of the city. However, the Russians managed to outflank the Ukrainians completely from the north, which is now aiming at outflanking these fortifications, attacking them from the rear and this northern flank, which will allow them to cut off the supplies to the fortifications here west of Siversk, as well as to outflank these fortifications to gain control of them for themselves, which will secure the southern flank of Siversk, as well as the highway connecting Siversk here in the east with Liman in the northwest. This means the Russians will be aiming to gain control of this defensive line, not just to allow their own forces to connect from the south and up to the north, but also to secure the southern flank for offensive operations in the direction of Liman, connected to Siversk in the southeast. To the southwest of Siversk, there's been updates in the Minat direction, where the Russians have managed to gain full control over the forest lines to the southwest of Minat, as well as the fortifications in the area. With this, the fighting is now completely centered around the city itself, and everything outside the city has been captured by the Russians. What remains under Ukrainian control is less than 6 square kilometers of Minat, which is about a third of the city. The Russians continue their fighting alongside the eastern flank with the capture of the apartment complex area, securing their foothold in that area, supply lines leading into the city, and the Ukrainian positions remaining now are in vulnerable positions except for the northern portion of the apartment complex area in the southern part of the city, as well as the central railway station area, which are the main defensive positions of the Ukrainians. And then finally in the northern outskirts, there's the industrial area, where Ukrainian forces are also located. These are the three main areas within the city itself, which remains under Ukrainian control, and the Russians are pushing from every direction to gain full control of it, which will then allow them to develop offensive operations beyond it, using both Pokrovsk and Minat as logistical hubs for offensive operations beyond the cities. To the southwest of this, along the second line of defense in the Zaporizhzhia Dnipropetrovsk region, the Russians managed to gain control over the corner of it and continue their offensive operations towards Ustapivsk, where the objective is to gain control over the fortifications and the settlement itself, and then push up northwards towards Andrivka, connecting with Ratne with Andrivka, and having a secure front line facing against Ukrainian forces operating to the north of Pokrovsk, where the Russian objective will be to establish defensive lines along the northern flank, which will give them a gap between Vidratne and Oleksandrivka to prevent Ukrainian counterattacks, having drone operators defending the northern flank. And with a wide distance between the two, it will be difficult for the Ukrainians to move up towards Vidratne, and in turn the Russians can focus on the offensive operations along the second line of defense and further down south. So the focus here is to achieve a buffer zone and focus the offensive operations down south along the defensive line, where they have gained control over much of the eastern flank of it. As for Hulyaipole itself, the Russians continue offensive operations into the southern parts of the city, getting control over additional streets from the northern flank, where they have been operating both from the eastern and northern directions, from Murphopil in the east, leading up to the city, and from Satisha in the north, advancing alongside the fortifications. This allows them to pour more and more infantry into the city, where the forces are slowly pushing through to gain control over one street after another, the northern flank of the fortifications, to clear the southern highway into the city and the central parts. As for the northern part of the city, the Russians have managed to gain control of a wide area of the center. The Russians here have managed to gain control of the fortifications leading into the city, which gives a clear road to Hulyaipole, forcing the Ukrainians to withdraw back across the Haichu River, and the Russians continued following them all the way up to the river line, where they now have pushed across it and established a foothold in the central parts of Hulyaipole. At the same time, they continue offensive operations in the northern direction, where they are squeezing the Ukrainian forces in between the river line in the north and Haichu River in the south, pushing through the residential buildings to clear the main areas where Ukrainian forces can operate from within, and pushing them out of the fortifications, then gain control over the Haichi River from the south, and then meet in the center, which is the south of the Propilia and north of Hulyaipole. Gaining control over the entire highway from Hulyaipole up towards the Nilivka will allow the Russians to have secure movement in the northeastern flank, where there is a lot of forest lines for cover for the infantry to move through, limiting the effectiveness of Ukrainian strikes on the Russian forces moving towards Hulyaipole outside the city itself. The reason for this is that there is a vast area north and east of Hulyaipole where Russian forces really can move anywhere through these forest lines on foot or lighter vehicles, which will allow them to move through the forest lines and the open fields without getting detected by Ukrainian drones, because Ukrainians simply do not have enough drones to cover the entire area. Therefore, the Russians will allow themselves to push through and into the city on foot, attacking through the forest lines and up towards the city. Currently, with the positions northwest of Hulyaipole, the Ukrainians are able to focus their drones on a much smaller area. However, if the Russians are able to gain control over that as well, it will double the area the Ukrainians need to cover. And if they gain control of the southern fortifications, it'll triple the area, and it'll become almost impossible for the Ukrainians to detect the Russian forces approaching the city before they actually reach the city itself. In the northern section near Kopansk, the Russians continued offensive operations to establish control over the eastern highway. From Kopansk itself, they pushed in the eastern direction towards Kucherivka, gaining control over the forest patch area in between the two, both the city and the town, pushing through into the farm areas, where they're looking to gain control over the area in between the two settlements, and then gain control over Kucherivka, while at the same time they're pushing towards the northern parts of Petropavlivka to completely secure the northern road into Kopansk, allowing for additional supplies moving through from the positions on the eastern bank of the Tuska River line and then into the central parts of Kupiansk on both banks of the river line. At the same time, the Russians will be looking to gain control over the entire highway. However, so far, the Ukrainians have been putting a lot of pressure on the Russian forces in the area, slowing down the capture of these positions, which forced the Russians to launch a new offensive from the northern flank to support the forces in the east. Otherwise, the encirclement of the forces within Kupiansk would be critical, and the Russian forces operating within it would be completely cut from supplies. And that's why it is a race against time for the Russians and the Ukrainians, or really against each other, of whether the Ukrainians will be able to completely cut off the supplies on the northern flank of the western parts of Kupiansk, or the Russians will establish the eastern supply lines. But there is a buffer zone between the Ukrainians capturing the northern supply lines and the Russians gaining control over the highways, where the results would not be too damning for the Russian forces, because the soldiers operating within Kupiansk won't starve in a single day, nor will they run out of bullets, ammunition, and so on. It'll take them a while for that to happen. Therefore, in the process of them having their supplies cut to them, actually being in a critical situation would take some time, and the Russians will still have that time to capture the highway, which is centered around Petropavlivka. Therefore, the capture of Kucherivka and Petropavlivka will allow Russians to have control over the highway leading up towards Kupiansk. And even if they can't use the highway, they'll be able to use the roads to the north, including the railway line, and the roads moving through Petropavlivka and Kucherivka and up towards Kupiansk, then across the river line and into the western parts of Kupiansk. The objective of the Russians is to gain control over the supply lines leading into Kupiansk, which will strengthen the defenses of Kupiansk, and then from there reverse the Ukrainian gains in the area. But more on this in the next update, as the Ukrainians have managed to meet some success. To the north of this, the Russians managed to gain control over the southern flank of the Vereshchansky, gaining control over the forest lines on the outskirts of the town, as well as the first patch to the west of it, as they continued developments towards Kolyasne and the settlements here to the southwest. At the same time, they also advanced both in the direction of Khashne and Ambarne, where they're pushing through from the forest lines closer to the settlements, where they've reached the outskirts of Ambarne and are pushing up towards Khashne, where they're looking to gain control over the settlements ahead of the defensive line of the Ukrainians, both to the northwest, near the highway and the defensive lines of anti-tank ditches and Dragonteeth lines, as well as to the south, where there is the conglomeration of settlements alongside the eastern flank of this front line. Finally, in the Vovchansk direction, the Russians have managed to gain control of the remaining parts of the Kharkiv-Liman, where they managed to gain control over the final streets and push down alongside the forest patch lines and the Sierska River, where they're continuing offensive operations to gain control over Vilche in the east and advance alongside the river line itself, where the objective is to push through and gain control over the western flank for offensive operations further east once they have secured their flanks. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.